said Fen. "The next person I want to see is this white-leg girl. Then I must put through a phone call to a friend of mine who used to be the Secretariat of the League of Nations, and then I must go and talk to the porter at the Mason Sceptre. Did I tell you, by the way, that the police have investigated Yuziette's movements during the hours before she came to the college? Very little of importance. She wrote some letters during the afternoon, had tea in her room, went and visited a young man in BNC, returned, put through an unspecified phone call from the Mason Sceptre, procuring a London directory from a porter, by the way, which is why I want to see him, and then apparently went straight to the college." "Is that helpful?" asked Nigel. "Not particularly. Actually, there's an outstanding blank in the whole business, which I should like to be able to fill in, though I don't see how I can. If only you hadn't gone gallivanting up to town, you might have been able to help. I didn't know there was going to be a murder." They watched for rehearsals of the play in silence for a few minutes. "Is that man who's just fallen down a flight of steps part of the play?" No. The door to the left of the auditorium opened, and Helen slipped out to join them. "A few minutes' respite. Lord, I don't know my lines in this act. Is this just recreation for you, Professor Fen, or do you hope to find a clue by watching all this?" "Oh, it is idleness, merely. Do you get nervous when it gets close to a first night?" "I'm scared out of my wits. Ordinary first nights are bad enough, but this is something in the way of a national event. Half the London agents, managers and producers will be down, and everyone will be trying to catch their eye. If it wasn't that Robert has a sort of iron remote control over the whole business, we would all overplay frightfully." "Would it help if I asked my friend—" He gave the name of an actor so celebrated that Helen's eyes widened. "To come down? He's looking for someone to play opposite in his next production, and I can see to it that he takes no notice of anyone but you. Besides, I have a hold over him. We were at school together. He did awful things." "Could you? I shall be terrified, but one must go through with these things." "He shall be summoned, and appear under threat of horrible revelations. Now, tell me, is this girl Jean Whiteleg anywhere about in the theatre?" "She should have arrived by now, though I know she said she'd be late this morning. She'll probably be in the prop room down the stairs to the left of the stage door." "Oh, my God, I'm on." "I can't find him anywhere. I've looked all over the house, under the... prompt." "Oh, for goodness sake, is there no one on the book? Jane! Jane, dear!" There was a subdued scuffling and turning of pages in the prompt corner, into which those on the stage gazed with weary contempt. Eventually a voice announced, "Under the floor, on the roof." "Yes, dear, do keep on the book, otherwise we waste such a lot of time." "I'm sorry, darling, but Michael's on the book during this scene, because I have to look after the panatrope." There ensued the sound of a surly argument backstage. "I don't care who does it," said Robert, "provided somebody does. All right, people, on we go." "I must seek out the white-leg dame." Do you need me?" "No, thank you, Nigel. This will be delicate and confidential. Quite unsuited to one of your frank, open, athletic temperament." Nigel glared after him as he went. Fen eventually ran Jean Whiteleg to earth in the green room, where she was sitting alone, reading a copy of Metromania without any particular attention. She was, Fen thought as he introduced himself, pretty obviously distrait. He regarded her with a curiosity befitting the final link in the little complex of motive and passion which had led up to the murder of Yuziette, noted that she was plain but not unattractive, quiet but by no means characterless, competent, and he suspected a little fanatical about the arts. Her soft brown hair, gently glowing in the morning light, was curled behind her ears. Her mouth was carefully rouged, and she wore a plain blue frock, designed to fit the needs of one easily conscious that her figure needs no disguising. Fen took a moment to admire her natural stealthy grace, and to wish that she could order her life more usefully than in performing mechanical jobs in the theatre. "You must forgive me bothering you, particularly as I believe the inspector was at you earlier this morning. But frankly, I don't think he much knows what he's about. Besides, I have an insatiable curiosity about these things. Like Webster, I am much possessed by death." He introduced the allusion deliberately, and watched with interest to see what reaction it would provoke. "Oh, the skull beneath the skin. I'm a little morbid myself. Do ask anything you like." "Well, first, then, you took the gun away from Captain Graham's room." He thought he saw a momentary expression of relief in her eyes.
"Yes, I went back to borrow it. Found he'd gone to bed, and, well, I'm afraid I just took it. I meant to let him know, but I've been hopelessly busy, and somehow or other I never got round to it."
"And you took it, of course, because you wanted it as property for Metromania."
"Oh, yes, of course, that's right. It's used in the last act, you see. We did have property guns, of course, but they went to the war effort. And we were told we could borrow any we wanted from the local police."
"Why didn't you do that?"
"It seems ridiculous. I mean, you see, we did borrow one once before, and, well, we lost that."
"Lost it?"
"It just disappeared at the end of a week. Things do tend to do that in repertory. If people don't borrow them, then they get covered with a mass of other stuff, and prove impossible to find. The result is the police don't regard us very favourably now, and I simply hadn't the nerve to go to them. Actually, I didn't think Peter Graham would lend me the gun, so that's why I took it. There you are, you see, that's the truth."
"I see. Rather a risk, wasn't it?"
"Well, Robert needed it for Thursday morning. He told me at the party, and I thought we could use it temporarily at least."
"Where was it left?"
"In the prop room."
"Can anyone get into it?"
"Yes, anyone. Sometime late on Thursday. It just went."
"And with it, I suspect, something else."
"Ah, how did you know?"
"Why not from there? It was perfectly convenient. I presume you didn't take the cartridges. You wouldn't have needed them."
"No."
"Were they there when you took the gun?"
I really don't remember."
"They might have been removed some time during the party, then."
"I suppose so."
Well, so I thought. And of course there's only Captain Graham's chance remark to suggest they were ever there at all. Now, would you mind giving me a true account of your movements yesterday evening, as opposed to the account you gave the police?"
"Oh, I told the police the truth. I was in my room at college all evening."
"I think not."
"Oh, please, Mr. Fenn, it's the truth. I didn't kill you yet."
I didn't exactly say you did. I'm so well acquainted with the truth about this business. Your assurances one way or the other do not particularly matter. It's simply that I like to get things straightened out."
"You know who did it?"
"I do."
"Need you tell the police? I mean—"
"Upon my soul. You are either the most charitable or the most immoral set of people I have ever come across in my life. Not one of you but wants the whole business passed over in silence. I find it very discouraging."
"Well—"
"That I shall have to think about. You are, if you will forgive me saying so, a poor liar, Miss Whiteleg. But then an adequate ability to dissemble appears completely lacking in this case. From beginning to end, the whole business has been an incompetent muddle, in which the hand of the author has been painfully obvious. I find it depressing. It has not been a battle of wits. It has been a walkover, and like all walkovers, it's turned sour on me. Perhaps that's why I feel reluctant to give the poor fish away. An atavistic survival of a code of honour. It's too easy to triumph over a second-rate mind."
"Has it not occurred to you that whoever did this may simply not have cared about dissembling, about the niggling intellectual puzzles and cryptograms which seem to delight you?"
"It has occurred to me, and I think that at first that was the person's attitude. A good deal of deliberate carelessness seems to suggest that. In actually committing the murder, however, that person decided at the 11th hour to create a cryptogram, and like all extempore cryptograms, it was only too dismally easy to solve. Thank you, Miss Whiteleg. You've been involuntarily informative, to a high degree. I've no wish to play the heavy uncle with you, and doubtless you're prepared to accept the responsibility for your actions. But I must warn you quite frankly that the game is up. I am not suggesting that you should go to the police, but I give you until Monday morning to come to me. God knows, girl, I know how difficult it will be. So take a grip on yourself. By the way, what are you reading up here?
Greats. Greek and Latin.
Fen nodded. I'll leave you now. Think over my peroration. If you don't do as I say, then I warn you, you might be putting another person's life in danger. Nigel was beginning to feel hungry. His attention wandered frequently from what was going on stage to the contemplation of lunch. This was the more so as it had suddenly occurred to him that by watching rehearsals he might be spoiling Monday night's performance for himself. This view was apparently shared by divine providence, which suddenly erected a barrier between him and Metromania in the shape of a safety curtain, a heavy contraption which was abruptly lowered, narrowly missing the head of husbandly Clive, who leapt out of the way with a startled oath. Nigel had barely time to digest the information imprinted thereon, to the effect that in the event of fire the theatre should be cleared in 3 minutes, before there was a bellow of rage from Robert, who was sitting some way behind him. This minatory noise apparently had the desired effect, and the safety curtain went up again, to disclose a small, bewildered group on the stage, casting vague glances up at the electrician's gallery, whence the curtain was operated. A confused discussion about responsibility was going on when Fen returned. "Allons, we have no further business here." They left the rehearsal in a state of mild chaos. "Well, my conjecture was right. There's little more we can do now. But I want to search Fellow's room, though I've little hope of finding anything." You mean for whatever Yuziet was looking for?" "Nigel, what a brilliant pupil you are! We shall make a detective of you yet." "I've no wish to be made a detective." "Be honest with me, Nigel. What ought I to do? For I confess my instinct as a good citizen is to hand over my results to the police, as I've done on other occasions. But then there are other considerations. Robert is a great playwright. Rachel is a fine actress. Nicholas, when he pulls himself together, has a first-rate brain. Fellows is a brilliant organist. Sheila McGaw is a good producer, and Jean Whiteleg is just an essentially nice person, too. Yuziet was not any of those things, and I do not want to see any of them caught in the soulless grinding of a forensic machine on her account, or by my agency. If only the police would use their common sense. It's their profession to catch and kill people, and such considerations wouldn't count with them. But they're going rampaging off on this suicide idea. Only my intervention will stop them." "It depends. Do you think the murderer is likely to act again?" "Another murder? I doubt it. Though I used that as a bait a few minutes ago." "Well then, I think that you should read Goethe's Tasso. More or less it's a study of how far the artistic temperament can go in defiance of society." "My dear Nigel, it states the problem, but it never gets anywhere near solving it. I'm inclined, to take the Philistine view that there's a good deal of hooey about the artistic temperament. So many of the greatest artists have been without it. Or rather, they had sufficient low cunning to satisfy their beyond good and evil tendencies sub rosa, without arousing the wrath of society. The artistic temperament is too often only an alibi for lack of responsibility. Vide the late lamented Yuziet. A skirt, if ever there was one." "My dear Gervais, if you must use these vile Americanisms, for heaven's sake use them correctly. Read Mencken. A skirt is a vulgarism for any sort of woman." "I think what I suggested to Helen would be the best thing. A brief and succinct warning to get out. The trouble is, we're all so damnably intelligent at Oxford. The fact of murder, which rouses an immediate instinct of self-preservation in the unsophisticated, has to penetrate to our animal souls through a thick barrier of sophisms. Apparently, in the present case, it hasn't even done that, merely bounced off again. Yet murder remains murder nonetheless. Prayer and meditation seem to be my only course. What it is to have conscience. To think that only a few days ago I was looking forward to some nice, clean, uncomplicated killing. You know what holds this business together, Nigel. Shall I tell you? It is sex, the questing beast. That's the root and the origin of the whole thing, reduced to its essentials." "You mean this has happened because people were taking it too seriously?" "No. Ironically enough, it happened because someone was not taking it seriously enough. God forbid we should wrap up this dismal tale in a heavy mantle of moralistic symbolism. The questing beast is a poetic convenience. It does not exist. They reached the hotel in silence, and Fenn made straight for the porter's box. The porter, a thin, competent-looking elderly man, received him with a smile. "Well, sir, how goes the investigation, if I may make so bold as to ask?" "Ah, I think you can probably help me there, Ridley. How did you come to hear about it, by the way? Oh, I suppose your racketeers have got hold of it at last." "Oh, it's all in the morning papers, sir. Which is to say, the bare facts are nothing beyond that. The local has a bit more, but it's only vapourings. Terrible thing, a young girl like that. Not but what she wasn't a bit of a Jezebel, if you'll pardon the liberty. Yes. Tell me, Ridley, do you think if a thoroughly objectionable person is murdered, the murderer deserves to get away with it?" "Well, now, I don't think so, sir, no. There's other ways of dealing with objectionable persons, other than murder. You see, Nigel? I take it then, sir, it was murder, not suicide?" "Well, that's what we're trying to find out, and that's where you can help me. The young lady came in here last night." "Yes, sir, about 25 or 20 to 8. She asked for the London directory, put through a call from one of the boxes over there, and left immediately afterwards." "Did you happen to notice if she was wearing any jewellery?" "Well, now, sir, it's funny you should ask that, because I was just thinking as she looked the number up how little jewellery young women wear nowadays as compared with 30 years ago. She had not a ring, not a necklace, not a bracelet, or a brooch even." "You're sure about that?" "Absolutely, sir. I noticed particular." "And that disposes finally of the possibility that Yuziet took the ring herself, and incidentally completes my case." "All done by intuition?" "Well, not exactly, because there was no occasion for it, really. You've had all the facts that I have had. More, you've had a lot of them first-hand. They give you everything you want. Do you honestly mean to tell me you don't know what this is all about?" "Not an inkling. I look to the resurrection. Until that, I'm in black darkness." "Your execrable profession has had a numbing effect upon a whilom promising, if mediocre, brain. Anyway, enough for now. I leave you until evensong tomorrow. I have a lot of beastly collection papers to correct, my notes to write up, and a lecture to prepare on William Dunbar. Motta Flodden." He marched to the door, turned, then waved cheerfully. "Concentrate. It will come to you eventually." In another moment he was gone. On Saturday evening, after the show, the theatre was given over to the technicians. While the company was still changing and removing makeup, the old set was already being demolished. Sunday morning saw the new one going up by the united labours of scenic designer, scene painter, stage hands, stage manager, and electricians, while actors and actresses gave themselves up to long, luxurious hours in bed, or read, or walked, or drank according to their tastes, or, in rare cases, even ran over their lines for the dress rehearsal in the evening. It was an interlude of calm before the final effort, before the culmination of that effort on the Monday night, and before another culmination more serious and less pleasant. Donald and Jean walked in the university parks. The previous day's rain had been given place to a cold, invigorating autumnal sunlight. The bells were silent, but in the churches and chapels of Oxford the worship of God was being prepared in sundry different ways, ranging from the highly polished brass of the Salvation Army to the incense and chasubles of the High Church, through a series of elaborate and faintly ludicrous doctrinal variations. But Oxford retains some vestigial reminders of the fact that it was once one of the Christian centres of Europe. Choir boys unself-consciously marked the streets in gowns and mortarboards. Organists secretly meditate on the registration, supposed by their admirers to be spontaneous, which is to be used in accompanying the psalms. Lay clerks put off their weekday occupations. Scholars destined to read the lesson wander about inquiring as to the pronunciation of the more recondite Hebrew proper names. The clergy are pregnant with brief intellectual sermons, dons prepare to pay homage to the deity. For some time Donald and Jean walked in silence. a silence of embarrassment on both sides, and a little of shame. Then Donald said, "I seem to be making a damn fool of myself. First over this girl, then by telling a lot of silly lies of what I was doing at the time of the murder. You know why I told them, don't you?"
Yes, I think I know, but really it wasn't necessary.
Jean, you didn't then?
Darling, it's really intolerable of you to suspect it. Why should I?
I just jumped to conclusions, I suppose. Silly of me, I know, but... Well, I've been a bit mad these past few months.
Were you really in love with her, Donald?
No, I don't think so. I think I was just fascinated by her beastliness. Despite the Helens of the world, men will still run after shopgirls. You know, in the circumstances, I've got a nerve to say it, but I think I'm in love with you.
Oh, Donald, how nice you are.
I'm not. I behaved perfectly abominably.
So have I. If I'd had a little more common sense, I'd have realised it was only an infatuation. Now, it's too late.
Well, I mean, it's not. Is it? Because I don't think so. Because, you see, in a way, her death has cleared everything up. It's brought us together again. And Rachel and Robert. The whole atmosphere's better. There seems to be no one who hasn't gained by it.
But somebody killed her. Who?
Well, whatever Fenn says, I think it was suicide. I hear that's what the police think, too. I hope to God they're right. What a glorious relief it would be if it all ended that way.
Fenn knows what he's doing, I'm afraid. It's maddening that it should all rest with him. I don't want to see anyone hanged for this.
As soon as this term is over, I'm going to volunteer for the RAF. It seems to contain most of the organists in the country anyway. You'll have finished here by then. And, well, as soon as I get my commission, I would like you to marry me.
Oh, Donald! Oh, how lovely that will be. I shall give up a theatre and keep house for you. I think that's what I wanted to do all along anyway. Oh!
She looked at him a moment with tears in her eyes. Then they kissed. Somewhere out of the mists of enchantment, a clock chimed. Good Lord, Matin's in 1/4 of an hour. Come on, darling. I shall sit and plan a full choral service for our wedding. Let the bright seraphim for the anthem. I'll hire St. Paul's Cathedral Choir to sing it. Nicholas looked at the blonde and said, People appear to get married for no reason at all. The reasons adduced by Christ's Church on earth have become, thanks to the march of science, grossly inadequate. I like to observe the way the standards of the Church have dropped. Originally, complete continence was the standard of virtue, and marriage a derogation of it. Now marriage is the standard of virtue, and unmarried love the derogation. No one nowadays takes seriously the imputation of feebleness contained in the words, such persons as have not the gift of continency. It's a great pity no one has any regard for chastity nowadays. Even the Church has more or less abandoned it, along with commination service and other inconvenient and uncomfortable parts of its rites. Of course, there are advantages to marriage. It eliminates the tedious and anaphrodisiac process of wooing, for one thing.
Don't try to be clever, Nick, said the blonde.
On the contrary, I was trying to bring my conversation down to a level where it would be comprehensible to you. Have another drink?
No, thanks.
She crossed her attractive legs and adjusted her skirt with meticulous care.
Tell me about the murder. I want to hear all about that.
I'm fed up with the murder. I never want to hear another word about it. To the end of my life.
I do. Do we know who did it?
Fenn thinks he knows. Oh, I know, he's been right on other occasions. But I don't believe in the infallibility of detectives.
If he says he knows, believe me, he does. I followed all his cases. He's never been wrong yet.
Well, if he does, I hope he keeps quiet about it, that's all.
You mean you don't want to see the murderer arrested? Well, that's a nice thing, if people can go about killing girls and getting away with it.
With some girls. It appears to be the only way.
Who do you think did it?
Who do I think did it? Good heavens, girl, I don't know. I expect I did it myself in a moment of mental aberration.
Really?
Lots of people had reason to. Half the town seems to be incriminated one way or another. Jean Whitelake took the gun, Sheila McGaw owned the ring that was found on the body, Donald and Robert Warner and I were all about when it happened, and Helen and Rachel have no alibis. I plumped for Helen myself. She had the only real motive, money. And Fenn's been running about after her with his eyes goggling and his tongue hanging out. He's always particularly nice to his murderers, before he has them arrested. Yes, I think Helen's the obvious choice. She's just the sort of sentimental, ignorant little thing who'd do something primitive like that.
I suspect you've sour grapes. She's been going about with that good-looking journalist recently, hasn't she?
Well, really, if that's your standard of male beauty...
All right, Mephistopheles. We know anything outside your infernal Byronic charm is anathema. You can get me another drink now, if you like. I'm going to gold dig you for all I'm worth this morning.
My, how you do pick things up. There are times when I wish that Timon's comments on Phrynia and Timandra had been a little more subtle and a little less openly offensive. They'd come in so useful. Robert and Rachel progressed in circles around Addison's Walk, the soft, clean, effeminate beauty of Magdalen just beyond them.
Are you nervous about tomorrow?
Not exactly nervous, no. Excited. I think it's going to be a good performance. The company's played up brilliantly. And you, my dear, are God's own gift to a producer.
Thank you, sir.
A first performance. Ridiculous effervescence of personal vanity. Look at me. The brilliant Mr. Warner showing off with a gang of actors and actresses. It's all it really amounts to. I remember the first play I ever put on, a little theatre club in London when I was still a struggling, insignificant repertory actor of 21. Lord, but wasn't that exciting? I went about pretending that it was the sort of thing that happened every day to me, weaving fantastic daydreams about a year's West End run, which, I may say, never materialised.
And I remember my first part in London, a very tarty Helen in a production of Troilus. I imagined all the critics would give me flattering bit-part notices. Special attention should be given to Miss Rachel West, who makes a brilliant miniature of an unsympathetic part. But in fact, none of them said anything about me at all.
You see, it's all vanity, really. Costals in Montaland's novel is the quintessential type of the artist, a self-indulgent, childish, ruthless egotist. Pulled to pieces, that's certainly all I amount to.
Oh, no, my Robert. No fishing for compliments. I'm not going to swell your vanity any further.
How well you know me, my dear.
Well, after 5 years,
I ought to. Would you consider marrying me?
Robert, my sweet, what has come over you? Is this a belated consideration for my honour? I warn you, if you say that again, I'll take you at your word.
You mean you would?
Why the astonishment? My feminine instinct has always been to get married, only you don't want to. And anyone else would have been intolerable.
You realise it'll involve a lot of rather tiresome gossip about the imminence of little strangers and so on.
That can't be helped. If people want to gossip, let them.
He made her sit down on a bench facing the river. For a long time now, I've been lusting after permanence. It's wearing to hold out against the conventions of society indefinitely.
Well, that takes a little edge off the compliment.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that. I think it would be rather a good marriage, don't you? One of those tranquil, permanent affairs. We know enough about one another to respect each other's madnesses and obsessions. Perhaps, like Prospero, I'm developing an obsession about marriage.
Has Yuziet's murder anything to do with it?
Well, a little perhaps. It's an object lesson in the awfulness of unregulated sex.
Oh, Robert! What is going to happen about it, the murder? Do you think this man Fenn really knows who did it?
I suppose so. I hope he keeps quiet, at least until after tomorrow night.
Wouldn't it be better if it were cleared up, rather than have it hanging over us?
But, my dear, it might be one of a cast, or you or me. If it were Donald or Nick, I suppose it wouldn't matter. But if you ask me, he's not going to do anything about it at all.
What are you going to do about it, Gervase? Asked Mrs. Fenn.
Fenn absently retrieved a ball hurled more or less in his direction by his small son and threw it back again. Don't ask me. I'm sick to death of the whole business.
Well, it's no good to keep on saying that.
Mrs. Fenn rescued her knitting wool from the attentions of the cat.
"You've got to make up your mind one way or the other."
"Will you advise me?"
"Oh, I can't possibly advise you unless I know who did it."
Gervase Fenn told her.
Oh, but how extraordinary."
"Yes, isn't it? Not what one would have expected."
"Well, I won't question you as to the why and wherefore. No doubt I shall hear about it eventually. But I do suggest you drop a gentle hint."
"I thought of that. But don't you see, whatever I do, I shall have it on my conscience till I reach the grave."
"Oh, nonsense, Gervase, you're exaggerating. I've a way you'll have forgotten completely about it in 3 months. And a detective with a conscience is ludicrous. If you're going to make all this fuss about it afterwards, you shouldn't interfere in these things at all."
"You're most unsympathetic. Everyone is. They advise me to read Tasso. Here am I on the horns of a Cornelian dilemma, torn between duty and inclination. What am I talking about? Ah, yes. Why has a dilemma horns, do you think? Is it a sort of cattle?"
"And to think that I never even remotely suspected. Mr. Warner was lecturing me on the murder, by the way, while you were downstairs. He said he thought the killer had come in by the way of the west courtyard."
"Did he? That was very lucid of him."
"As far as I could see, it was impossible. I told him so. He seemed very disappointed."
"Well, I imagine that was only politeness. He's quite genuinely not interested in the investigation. Not really surprising, when he's got a first night coming off on Monday."
"Is it a good play?"
"Brilliant. Rather in the Johnsonian tradition of satire."
"Oh, I never did like Volpone. It's cruel and grotesque."
"All good satire is cruel and grotesque. John, you mustn't take the cat by the tail and dip it in and out of a pond like that. It's cruel."
"Well, anyway, I shan't come to see it."
"You can't come and see it. There's no room."
"Who are you going with, then?"
"Nigel and Sir Richard."
"Nigel's a nice boy. Didn't you say he was going about with Helen?"
"No doubt he's gadding about somewhere with her now. Anyway, he borrowed my bicycle. I hope he looks after it. People are so careless." Fenn's bicycle was a large, uncompromising affair, apparently constructed out of pig iron. Nigel, as he toiled down Walton Street on it with Helen at his side, regretted, not for the first time, Fenn's monastic indifference to scientific progress. Once they reached the towpath, however, the going was easier, and they bowled along merrily enough towards their destination, the trout. "I wish that you didn't imagine you were in for a track race."
"All right, slow coach." "Oh, honestly, though, I have a conscience about this expedition. Yuziet killed only the day before yesterday, and here am I cycling about Oxford in a pair of red corduroy slacks. Everyone who's passed has looked profoundly shocked."
"That's the trousers, not your unsisterly behaviour."
"I wonder if Fenn ever oils this thing." "Look out, you'll be in the water in a minute."
"I'm not going to talk till we arrive. It's too exhausting. Then a drink, several drinks. We'll have lunch somewhere in the meadows beyond. What time have you got to be back for your dress rehearsal?"
"I ought to be in the theatre by 5:30.
"I've got evensong at 6. That'll fit nicely." At the Trout they found Sheila McGaw with a miscellaneous party.
"Hello. Are you taking the opportunity of getting out of Oxford too? What with policemen and one thing and another, it's getting to be unlivable in."
"Don't talk to us about policemen. We're like the Foreign Legion. We've come out to forget." They had their lunch on the bank of a tiny tributary stream which meandered absurdly over a muddy bottom. There they ate sandwiches and tomatoes and apples. Helen, raising herself on one elbow, remarked,
"It's extraordinary how hard the ground can be."
"Well, don't slide off the mackintosh, silly. The ground's damp from yesterday's rain. Is there another tomato?"
"You've had 4 already."
"I asked for a tomato, not a lecture."
"I gave you the lecture in default of a tomato. There are no more."
"Oh. Helen, will you marry me?"
"I was hoping you were going to say that." "No, you can't kiss me now. My mouth's full."
"But you will, then?"
"Will you make me a good husband?"
"No, abominable. I'm only asking you because you've just come into such a lot of money."
"Would you be likely to interfere with my career?"
"Horribly."
"How soon do you want to get married?"
"I wish you wouldn't scrutinize my proposal as if it were a length of bad cloth. The proper thing is to fall rapturously into my arms."
"I can't. The food's in the way."
"Well, we'll move the food, then." He hurled it wildly in all directions and took her in his arms.
"When can we get married, Nigel? Can it be soon?
As soon as you like, my dearest.
Don't there have to be bans and licences and things?
Oh, you can get special licences. In fact, if you pay £25 for an archbishop's special licence, you have powers of life and death over every clergyman in the country.
Oh, you do make love beautifully, Nigel.
Darling, you should never say that. Nothing goes to the head of a male species more disastrously. Of course, although you are now disgustingly rich, I shall insist on supporting you.
You will do nothing of the sort. Let all that money go to waste.
Oh, I was hoping you'd say that. I thought I'd better say the proper thing first.
You beast. You know, I don't think the open air's a good place for making love.
Nonsense, it's the only place.
I think Phillida and Corridon must have ended up with a lot of bruises.
Where is the best place?
Bed.
Helen!
Darling, we're husband and wife, in the sight of God, and these things are a fit subject for discussion between us. Oh, look at the mess I'm in.
A sweet disorder in the dress, kindles in clothes, a wantonness.
No, Nigel, remember you promised. No Elizabethan verse. Oh dear, why do you literary young men always quote? Stop it, darling.
She put her arms round his neck, and Herrick was very appropriately smothered in a kiss. They lay back, laughing and exhausted, and gazed at the cream-soft clouds which hung motionless in the pale blue sky above their heads. Nigel reflected, as he turned into St. Christopher's at 20 to 6 that evening, that there was something extraordinarily schoolboyish about Gervase Fenn. Cherubic, naive, volatile, and entirely delightful, he wandered the earth taking a genuine interest in things and people unfamiliar, while maintaining a proper sense of authority in connection with his own subject. On literature his comments were acute, penetrating, extremely sophisticated. On any other topic he invariably pretended complete ignorance and an anxious willingness to be instructed, though it generally came out eventually that he knew more about it than his interlocutor, for his reading in his 42 years on the planet had been systematic and enormous. If this ingenuousness had been affectation, or merely arrested development, it would have been simply irritating, but it was perfectly sincere, and derived from the genuine intellectual humility of a man who has read much, and in so doing has been able to contemplate the enormous spaces of knowledge which must inevitably always lie beyond his reach. In temperament he was incurably romantic, though he ordered his life in a rigidly reasonable way. To men and affairs his attitude was neither cynical nor optimistic, but one of never-failing fascination. This resulted in a sort of unconscious immoralism, since he was always so interested in what people were doing and why they were doing it that it never occurred to him to assess the morality of their actions. This fuss about what he shall do in connection with Usiet's murder, thought Nigel, is entirely characteristic. He discovered him in his room, putting the final touches to his notes on the case. The police have definitely decided it was suicide, so these papers will all have to be put into cold storage for a while. By the way, I've decided what I'm going to do. See this? He handed him a small piece of paper on which were written the words of Horace. Deprende miserum est. It's horrible to be found out. Ah, so? So, I put this in the post this evening, and hand over my notes to the police on Tuesday morning. That gives the murderer a remote chance to clear out. By the way, I rely on you not to let this go any further. I've discovered I'm committing a criminal offence. Well, in that case, do you think it's really wise? Oh, it's very unwise, my dear Nigel, hopelessly so. But after all, I've got the whip hand. I can always tell the police I realised my idea was wrong, and that I'm as much at a loss now as they. No one can prove anything to the contrary. Besides, if one wasn't a little adventurous sometimes, the world would be intolerable. Well, it's up to you, I suppose. There, now, this shall be delivered into the hands of a GPO after chapel. Has it occurred to you that you may be endangering the lives of a lot of totally innocent people by setting a murderer on the run? Yes, I know. It has occurred to me. But I do not think this person will kill again. Tell me, have you still no idea who did it? I spent last night in the time-honoured stooge's task of getting out a timetable, and as I expected, got no enlightenment from it whatever. Anyway, Half the assertions in it are unproved or unprovable. See, here it is. It's your business now, as the great detective, to glance at this and tap it with your finger, and say, "This reveals all." Well, do you know, it does. And I can't help it if you're so dumb you don't see why. I've got a similar table with certain things underlined and a few comments added. Look at it again, dear boy. Doesn't it leap out at you like a wart on a bald head? No, it doesn't. From 6 o'clock, Robert, Rachel, Donald and Nicholas in a bar of the Mason Sceptre. Usiette at BNC, Helen in her room, Sheila and Jean in theirs. Last three are unconfirmed. 6:25. Donald, Nicholas, leave M&S, arriving in college at 6:30 approx, when Rachel also leaves to go to the cinema. Destination unconfirmed. 6:45 approx, Helen arrives at theatre. 7:10 approx, Usiette leaves BNC. 7:35 to 40, Usiette arrives at M&S, puts through a phone call. 7:45, Helen goes on at theatre. Donald and Nicholas cross to room opposite Donald's. 7:30 approx, Robert leaves M&S for college, unconfirmed. 7:54, Usiette arrives at college. 7:55, Helen comes off stage. 8:05, Robert arrives at college. 8:21 approx, Robert goes down to lavatory. 8:24, shot heard. 8:25, Usiette found dead. 8:45, Helen goes on again at theatre. Jean and Sheila say they remained in their rooms all evening, unconfirmed. Rachel says she remained at the cinema till 9 o'clock, unconfirmed. Donald and Nicholas say they remained in room from 7:45, unconfirmed. I do not see it's any use at all. Half the statements may be false. No doubt half the statements are. But how revealing all those unconfirmeds are. It does give the game away, Nigel. Why did you include Helen, incidentally? You don't suspect her? Well, of course not. But it filled it out a bit. It was rather thin, otherwise. Now, look here, Fen. I don't want to know who did it, but I should like to know it wasn't Helen. Of course it wasn't Helen. As a matter of fact, I just asked her to marry me. My dear fellow! Oh, I'm delighted! Oh, we must celebrate! Oh, but not now. Evensong awaits us. Oh, congratulations! He picked up a surplice which was lying over the back of a chair. This thing, he said, putting it over his arm as they went out, puts me in mind of shrouds. As he entered the chapel, Nigel had the comfortable sense of one who returns to a remembered spot, in the certainty that it will not have been altered. On the whole, he'd always been inclined to agree with old Wilkes that the restorations had been well carried out. The place had a clean, finished look about it, without being aggressively new, and it fortunately lacked the faint odour of corruption which is generally present in old churches. The glass, while not being of the sort to attract connoisseurs, was pleasing enough, and the organ, a new instrument put in 7 years previously and occupying the gallery on the north side of the chancel, had plain gold pipes charmingly arranged in a simple geometrical pattern. The organist and his mode of exit, an iron ladder leading down to the vestry, was hidden from view by a large fretted wooden screen, his means of ascertaining what was going on below being a large mirror suspended above his head. And from the instruments there issued now one of those vague opiate improvisations which organists appear to consider the limit of their responsibilities before the service actually begins. Fen departed to the seats reserved for the fellows. Nigel settled himself close by the choir. There were few people in the chapel that evening. The president glowered morosely from his box. There was a small number of undergraduates and visitors. Before long the choir and the chaplain came in, and the improvisation performed a rapid, pyrotechnical series of modulations into the key of a first hymn, and stopped. Announcement, first line of Richmond, then Samuel Johnson's fine hymn, City of God, how broad and far, outspread thy walls sublime. For once Nigel was unmoved by what he considered one of the best pieces of religious verse in the English language. As he held the book up, making conventional noises in his throat, and opening and shutting his mouth in rhythmic but improbable ways, to the alarm of one of the Decani boys, who stared at him with mingled horror and fascination, his thoughts wandered to the events of the past few days. Who had killed Luciette Haskell? Robert Warner was the most likely candidate, but it was difficult to see how even he could have done it. Was the suicide perhaps faked before the girl was shot? That was ridiculous. Unless she was hypnotized, Luciette would never have allowed herself to be put through the necessary rigmarole. He wondered, as the doctor in illustration of his theses demonstrated the vanity of the surge's angry shock, whether she had even known who killed her, and then realized that she must, for one terrible moment, have seen the murderer. Those powder burns. She had been shot point-blank in the middle of the forehead. "Dearly beloved brethren, the Scripture moveth us in sundry places." Nigel hastily kicked a kneeling mat into position and dropped down on it, glanced across at Fenn, but the professor seemed preoccupied. The fellow's stall was cleverly designed so that no one outside could see whether they were kneeling or not, with the result that most of them had developed the lazy and irreverent habit of simply slumping forward on the desks in front of them during prayers. Old Wilkes, a short distance away, was apparently sunk in a deep coma. Nigel remembered his story, told on that fateful Friday evening. Only 2 days ago? It seemed more like 2 years. He looked instinctively into the antechapel, where John Kettenber, too militant a champion of the Reformed faith, had been hunted to death by Richard Pegwell and his associates. Cave ne exeat, vex not his ghost. Nigel dismissed these unprofitable reflections to admire the singing of the psalm, and the musicianship that had gone into it. Just that touch of preciosity, that lengthening, shortening, or corruption of vowels which is the prerogative of a good choir. The boys were good. Even the head boy showed none of the all-too-common tendency to exert his authority by hooting. Here, Nigel felt, Donald was in his element. Outside, he was ineffectual, incompetent in his affairs, foolish in his relationships, but here he had unchallenged mastery. It was after the theatrical and triumphant strains of the Dyson Magnificat, reaching their elaborate conclusion, that a sense of unease first became discernible. For one thing, the boys seemed unusually fidgety. They scratched their ears and gaped about and whispered and dropped their books to such an extent that even the lay clerks, who had the prerogative of poking them ferociously from behind when they misbehaved, seemed unable to restore order. Finally, it was discovered that the head boy had forgotten, for some reason which remains unknown to this day, to give the men their copies of the anthem. So at the beginning of the Nunc Dimittis, the second boy was sent out to the vestry by the cantoris tenor to fetch them, and he astonished the gathering by returning empty-handed during the Gloria, and fainting before he got back to his place. There was some confusion. 2 of the men took him out and left him in charge of the porter, returning hastily at the end of the collects with the necessary copies. For a while all was well. The anthem, Charles Wood's Expectans Expectavi, passed without incident, as did the subsequent prayers which preceded the final hymn. There was no sermon that evening. Order appeared to have been restored. In Hymns Ancient and Modern, No. 563, and Songs of Praise, the choir awaited the statement of the tune. But there was no sound from the organ. Eventually the decane-eyed tenor, a fat, authoritative man in full command, gave a note and a signal, and the hymn went forward unaccompanied. The chaplain, the president, and the fellows stared puzzled at the organ loft. Out of the corner of his eye, Nigel saw Fenn leave his seat and slip out of the chapel. Stealthily he followed, catching him up as he entered the vestry by the outside door and switched on the light. On his face Nigel saw an expression of mingled anger and anxiety. There was no one in the vestry, and Fenn made straight for the small arched doorway on the right, whence an iron stairway ran up to the organ loft. Nigel followed at his heels, his thoughts unpleasantly full of a recollection of John Kettenberg. The stairway was dark and chill, running up through an unpierced well of damp stone, and once he looked over his shoulder. They arrived in the organ loft. It resembled many another such. There were framed photographs of other organs, St. Paul's Truro, King's Cambridge, cases and shelves of music and hymn books, an old comfortable chair for moments of inactivity, a Primus stove on which Donald had been accustomed to make tea during the President's rather lengthy sermons. What else he had expected to see, Nigel never knew. What they did see was Donald Fellows, lying across the organ stool with his throat cut from ear to ear, and a blood-stained knife on the floor near him. The next few hours had, for Nigel, in retrospect, the proportions and inconsequence of a nightmare. He remembered Fenn saying, in tones of bewilderment, utterly uncharacteristic of him, I couldn't have known. Oh, God help me, I couldn't have known. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost. Nigel stared down. Could a woman have done this? Fenn? Could a woman have done this? It has been known. There was the business, then, of getting rid of the choir, informing the college authorities, keeping away unwelcome sightseers, telephoning the police. Fenn went and interviewed the boy who'd fainted. His story was incoherent, but they were able eventually to elicit the main facts. He'd entered the vestry at the chapel and found it in darkness. The light switch was by the outer door. He'd been about to walk over and put it on when he'd heard a slight movement in the darkness, and someone or something had whispered to him an invitation to come in and shake hands, a thing which he had felt little inclined to do. He had stood for a moment in fright, and then run back into the chapel, after which he remembered nothing more. Asked whether the voice was that of a man or a woman, he replied reasonably enough that when a person is whispering it's impossible to tell, and added that he thought it had been neither, at which Fenn, who had recovered something of his normal manner, went away snorting with annoyance, and deploring the influence of M.R. James on the very young. The time of death, even apart from the doctor's contributory evidence, was easy to establish. It had been somewhere between the anthem and the last hymn, that is to say, somewhere between 6:35 and 6:45. The inspector inquired how it was that no sound of a struggle had been heard, but Nigel, who'd visited the organ loft several times during his undergraduate days, remembered that in fact very little was audible, even from immediately below. A few experiments proved this to be correct. As to the weapon, its provenance was easily discovered. It belonged to the kitchen, situated near the chapel, which served the senior common room, and was a sharp, thin-bladed affair of a fairly common type. The kitchen had been unattended since 5:30 that afternoon. There were no fingerprints on the knife, except some old ones belonging to one of the kitchen men. On the iron staircase some traces of rubber-soled shoes were found, but they'd been partly obliterated by Fenn and Nigel. It was impossible to tell either their type or size. In the vestry, apart from a few smears made by someone wearing gloves, there was nothing. Fenn turned the loft inside out in a fruitless search, and then asked the inspector, "When did you take your guard off Fellows's room?" 4:30 this afternoon." "Then I fancy we shall find that has been searched too." Investigation proved him right. They discovered nothing to help them. The porter was questioned as to the presence of strangers in the college that evening. He'd seen no one, but he pointed out that there were half a dozen side entrances by which anyone could have come in unobserved. Those undergraduates and dons who'd been in college but not in chapel were then assembled in hall and asked if they'd seen anyone in the college between 5 and 7 whom they did not know. Again, negative results. This series of frustrations was beginning to harass the inspector exceedingly. Sir Richard maintained a gloomy silence, and Fenn, while following the proceedings with sufficient attention, seemed little concerned about the outcome. Conveniently enough, all possible suspects were found at the dress rehearsal when they arrived there towards 8 o'clock, including Nicholas, who'd come to watch. Inconveniently enough, none of them could be eliminated, since not a single one had an alibi which would bear investigation. A few who claimed immunity were rapidly shown that they had nothing of the sort. Most of them had not arrived at the theatre till 6:45, and some later. And as the theatre was only 5 minutes' brisk walk from St. Christopher's, nobody could be freed from suspicion. When Robert assembled the company on stage at the end of the first act for notes, they were told, and apart from a manifest unease, there was no special reaction. Only Jean gave a little strangled cry of dismay, and went straight to Fenn, remaining talking to him incoherently for some time. Nigel had no opportunity to see Helen alone, but he read the fear and dismay in her eyes. It was a dispirited little party that returned to St. Christopher's. Back in Fenn's room, the inspector frankly admitted himself at a loss. There was no more talk of suicide, and obviously all he now cared for was getting the whole business cleared up and done with as soon as humanly possible. "We've nothing to go on, sir. If you can't help us, nobody can. In its own way, this is the perfect crime, because there's not a handle anywhere."
Yes, a perfect crime, because a lucky crime. The murderer entered the college by a back way, unobserved, took the knife from the kitchen and went up to the organ loft, frightened away that boy on the way, then killed Fellows and left, still unobserved. The murderer had fantastic luck. Whoever killed Fellows saw to it that his or her buttons were properly sewn on before leaving, refrained from smoking, and failed to catch his or her clothing on projected nails. All very excellent, but because of the murder of Youziette there is no doubt who the person is, and it is my fault Fellows was killed. I could not have foreseen it. It was impossible to foresee. But if I had acted sooner, I could have prevented it. Then who is the murderer, Fen? I'll tell you. But there is one simple condition. Will you excuse us, Nigel? I'd rather you didn't know just yet.
Oh, right.
I'll go outside and have a smoke.
As Nigel wandered round the garden for half an hour, Fen talked to Sir Richard and the inspector in a low voice, explaining, emphasizing, illustrating. As he talked, Sir Richard tugged at his moustache, and the inspector's face fell. Then they went away.
Nigel, Fen said an hour later, as they sat together in his room, it appears my scruples have been a trifle imbecile.
I'm afraid that I've been in a state of superstitious terror over the whole business.
Superstitious terror? Oh, you mean Wilkes's fairy tale.
It's time that particular college ghost was laid once for all. I've taken the opportunity of investigating the business. I've discovered a dirty bit of work, which you may have guessed at. As I suspected, the president at the time wasn't at all sober. He was an old fool who'd got his position by nepotism and influence. And you must remember that all the ghost part of it, apart from one or two easily explainable atmospheric incidents in the chapel, came from Archer, the dean. Parkes, it seemed, never mentioned his nocturnal adventurer to anyone else. And a very pretty piece of invention it was, too, though the business about John Kettenberg and the chapel wall gave it a convenient cadder. The relationship between Archer and Parkes was, it seems, of such a discreditable kind that in those puritanical times not a whisper of it could be allowed to come out. Then Parkes decided to do a bit of blackmail, and Archer polished him off, concealing the weapon, heaven knows where, before the others arrived. Good God! How did you guess? All that dog Latin, of course. What youth in his senses would bellow out a Latin invocation for deliverance while being clubbed to death, even by a ghost? What he really shouted was the name of a man who was killing him, and as he was a church organist and not a classical scholar, I'm willing to bet, he used the ecclesiastical pronunciation and said ch, for c. But I suppose that tale Archer spun, coming from a convinced rationalist, shook them a bit. They weren't very bright, and he was a very respectable man. They didn't tumble to it. He must have had some uneasy moments, though. No wonder he turned churchman. Supernatural, my dear Holmes.
In more senses than one. What about Wilkes's theory of the ghost operating through the living?
That is hooey. Anyone who's not actually demented can prevent himself from committing a murder. Possession by demons is always a convenient way of shelving responsibility. Oh, that reminds me.
He took from his pocket the envelope he'd addressed earlier that evening. He tore it into small fragments and threw them on the fire. They watched in silence as the paper caught, flared, and shrank away into ashes.
Tomorrow night we go hunting.
By 6 o'clock, the queue for the unreserved seats already stretched a quarter of a mile down the road. At 7, the commissionaire went out, counted them, compared their number with the seats available, and informed those that would be unable to get in of the uselessness of waiting. The latter part of the queue broke up and dissipated, but a great many of its members continued to wait about, partly in order to see any celebrities who might be recognizable, partly in the hope that some of the reserved seats might not be claimed, and that they may still be able to get in. 3 policemen inefficiently, but self-importantly, regulated the increasing flow of people. Even those who had booked seats arrived early to claim them, fearful of not getting in, and having done so, hung about in small knots on the lawns in front, chattering excitedly. From every hotel in Oxford came agents, theatrical managers, actors, actresses, producers, critics, and fellow playwrights. Some, who had not been able to leave town earlier on account of business, came direct from the station in taxicabs. The intelligentsia of the university arrived with habitual expressions of boredom. Dons arrived and made their way in with the practised ease and tranquillity of those in authority, and everywhere there was talk, talk, talk. A group of 3 eminent critics stood outside, talking spasmodically and glancing nervously over their shoulders. "Shakespeare foresaw it," said Nicholas gloomily as he passed in with the blonde on his arm. "An agate vilely cut." The electrician, Richard Ellis, Sheila McGaw, and the stagehands stood in a bemused group in one corner, watching the ever-increasing flow of people as it came from all directions, and consumed with inner excitement. Robert strolled out to greet a group of friends who had just come down from London, and was the object of interest and covert scrutiny. Black and white posters on all hands announced the first performance of Metromania with a sobriety somewhat out of keeping with the general furore. Rachel, in her dressing-room, performed the difficult double task of applying mascara to her eyes and running over her part in the book that lay open beside her. Jean conducted a last-minute survey of properties, even in her acute inner unhappiness not wholly unaffected by the prevailing atmosphere, and most of the men in the company were still in the Aston Arms, acquiring Dutch courage under the minatory gaze of the parrot. Clive had already torn himself away from the arms of his wife and was moving towards the theatre at all speed, probably to be in time for the performance. The bar, which had been provided with 5 extra staff and an emergency counter erected at one end, was packed to overflowing. Helen, entering the stage door with Bruce, looked at the crowds in alarm and spent the next 3/4 of an hour trying to forget them. Robert's publisher made a gloomy mental note to raise the royalties in the contract for Metromania. Robert himself remained cool and grave, but inwardly felt more nervous than he'd ever been in his life. Fenn said, as he, Nigel, and Sir Richard walked towards the theatre, "The last time I went to this theatre I swore I'd never go again, yet here I am, apparently. I hope, by the way, Nigel, that my actor friend turns up in good time, for I should like to take him round to meet Helen before the show." Nigel just nodded, too excited for words. "And," said Fenn in a lower voice to Sir Richard, "I suppose all the arrangements are all right?" "Yes, the inspector and his people will be there in plenty of time. There are a number of them now, of course, dealing with the crowds. I'm sorry that you had to spoil the evening by making this arrangement." "Well, God knows I'm sorry too, but you know it couldn't be helped. I don't really see why it need prevent us enjoying ourselves." "You are a curious man." "Well, it's certainly not going to prevent me. You might tell me what you're up to." "At the end of the show we are going to call a little meeting, and an arrest will be made. All very quietly, of course, when the excitement has died down. Only the people chiefly concerned will be there." Oh, it seems a pity." "Throat-cutting and shooting are also a pity." "God, what a crowd! I suppose you've got tickets?" "Tickets? Oh, my ears and whiskers! I've left them on my desk." "Oh, yes, so you did. So I took 'em. I trust you no further than I do your opinion of Charles Churchill. Come on, Gervase, for heaven's sake, don't sulk." After some difficulty they discovered the eminent actor and bore him round to the stage door to see Helen. Nigel and Sir Richard, thinking discretion the better part of valour, ploughed their way through a sea of mackintoshes, feet, and programmes to their seats. The eminent actor was discreet, charming, and businesslike. "It's cruel of us to disturb you at a time like this. I know I'm always terrified out of my wits on these occasions."
"Yes, I am nervous."
Fenn wandered about the dressing-room, experimentally smearing his face with sticks of grease paint. 5 minutes, please. 5 minutes, please." "Good heavens! We must go. For heaven's sake, take that stuff off your face, Gervase. No, don't rub it in with your handkerchief, you ass. You have to put grease on it first. Oh, there. Wipe it off with this towel." Fenn, somewhat chastened by these proceedings, merely grunted.
"There's really no need to hurry," said Helen. "With all these people we're sure to go up late. I'm not in till the second act."
"None the less," said the eminent actor, "I think we should go. I shall watch the first act for the sake of Robert, and the last 2 for the sake of you. Good luck. Break a leg." In the auditorium the footlights went up, bathing the lower part of the curtain in a subdued white glow. Fenn, after taking leave of the eminent actor, with the remark, Remember that time you pushed Cumber of the lower fourth into the lake? And joined Nigel and Sir Richard. Nigel looked about him and saw the inspector there in plain clothes, accompanied by two solid-looking companions, some way behind. Sheila McGaw was at the back of the 1 and 6pennies. Nicholas and his blonde 2 rows ahead. Robert and his party in the front row. Backstage the beginners trooped down from the dressing rooms. The assistant stage manager settled down by the prompt copy. Jane gave a last professional glance at the sets.
Lights!
A series of clicks from the electrician's gallery, and the stage was lit from floods, spots, and battens. The beginners settled down in their places.
House lights!
The auditorium was darkened. The doors were barred against gate-crashers, latecomers, and other pests. The chattering died. Clive, suddenly beset by the conviction that something was amiss, rushed off the stage, retrieved a newspaper, and returned to his place, where he opened it and gazed at it in an interested manner.
Curtain!
With a soft, insinuating hiss, the curtain went up on the first performance of Metromania. From the first moment there was no question but it was going to be a success. Nigel, with the inner cautiousness born of his Scotch ancestry, had wondered whether the build-up would be too much for the play, but he need not have troubled. From Robert the audience had expected great things, and in a literal sense they got them. From a company they had not expected much, and it was the more pleasing to have that expectation disappointed. Even Sheila grudgingly admitted that they'd never worked so well together. Timing, climaxes, curtain lines, all perfect. It was a performance no one in the company ever forgot. From the beginning they knew they were working well together, and the audience was as perfect as an audience can be. As the play continued, those who were not on stood in the wings and hardly dared to speak about it for fear of breaking the spell. Rachel, it goes without saying, was the heroine of the evening. She moved through the play with a fluent, lissom grace, exquisitely controlling and focusing the whole structure about her. The others, though acknowledging their dependence, yet lived and moved in their own right. And when Helen had been on the stage 5 minutes, Nigel could have shouted with excitement. Without question, it was the performance in a million. The gradual heightening of tension left everyone, actors and audiences alike, in a state of emotional exhaustion at the end of the evening. But it was the play itself which was responsible. As he watched it, Nigel found himself marvelling at its revelation of a unique and particular genius. In the first act it might have been nothing more than a particularly witty and eccentric comedy, were it not for the extraordinary ease with which each character insinuated his or herself into the comprehension of the audience. The second act was at once more serious and more impressive. There was less frank laughter, and there was an ever-growing sense of uneasiness, impossible to set it aside. The people of the first act, without losing their identity, became less humorous and more openly grotesque. It was not that they personally developed, it was that more and more was shown of their real selves. The last act was played in semi-darkness, under the shadow of an impending physical disaster. Now everyone except Helen and Rachel seemed degenerated into monstrous puppets in automania, mouthing words that were a terrifying parody of their former selves. It was done without expressionistic effects, in the frame of an ostensibly naturalistic play. But as they lost their hold on the sympathy and faded into mere talking shadows, so Helen and Rachel stood out more and more as real persons. At the end it was as if there was a sudden gust, and the shadows were dissipated, leaving those two alone, on a note of sudden personal tragedy, delicately and movingly hinted at. The play ended. There were 23 curtains. At the 5th, Robert appeared, holding the hands of Helen and Rachel. There were flowers by the 1,000. At the 15th curtain call, Robert made a speech. "I don't expect you'll want to hear another speech by me tonight, but I should just like to say thank you for being such a delightful audience, and to express my very heartfelt thanks to the company and technicians of this theatre for attempting and achieving so magnificently the Herculean task of putting on a new play in the course of a week. Any applause which there has been this evening should be theirs." The riot in the theatre redoubled. They'd had to take 8 more curtains before they were allowed to go. It had been a glorious evening. And it was then that Nigel remembered, with a cold chill of foreboding, What was still to come? He read it in the changed look of Fenn's eyes, in the glance which Sir Richard threw at the inspector as they went out. He saw the inspector move across and say something in a low tone, first to Sheila McGaw, and then to Nicholas Berkeley. The excitement of the evening began too rapidly to ebb, and a feeling of depression took its place. True, there was still a good deal of commotion going on around them. When he reached Helen's dressing room, for example, he found the eminent actor already there, and the offer of the London job already made. But although he was sincerely glad, he could not wholeheartedly rejoice with this other thing still on his mind, and he was relieved when the remainder of the company left the theatre, chattering noisily in search of supper, to be followed by a first-night party. When the staff finally cleared up and left, and the theatre was given over to the incongruous and empty silence, he left Helen to finish dressing and went to the bar. Fenn, Sir Richard, the inspector, and Nicholas were already there. The others joined them at intervals. Robert was obviously tired and exhausted, Nicholas pale and unusually silent, Jean insignificant, suddenly drained of colour and personality. Nigel thought there was a look of sheer animal fright in Sheila's eyes. Helen and Rachel were the last to arrive, Rachel quiet and obviously distrait, Helen still keyed up to a high pitch of nervous tension. She came across and took Nigel's hand. They stood in a silence, intensified by the sudden small noises from the rest of the theatre, and stood among the wreckage and ghostly remains of an unprecedented evening, waiting for the curtain to go up on the last act of another play. I'm extremely sorry to have to close a, for me, unforgettable evening. He bowed slightly to Robert, who gave him a tired smile in return, in this disagreeable way. But I think you may all, well, that some of you, may be glad to see the business of this double murder finally off our hands. It would be in the poorest taste for me to explain to you now the reasons which have decided us to take action, but I should just like to say that I personally very much regret having to be an agent in the matter at all. To anyone of sensibility and imagination, an occasion like this is not a subject of congratulation. It is a Pyrrhic victory. And unexpectedly there slipped into Nigel's mind at that moment the one cardinal fact he had been looking for so long. In retrospect, he decided that had it not been for the peculiar mental strain he was undergoing, it would never have come to him at all. But after it, the rest fell into place, with ever-increasing momentum, all pointing to one person, all spelling out the letters of one familiar name. Suddenly Helen gripped his arm, so violently it hurt.
"Nigel, where's Jean?"
Jean Whiteleg was gone. He bent a confused mind to hear what Fenn was saying. Finally, it might be well for me to say that every entrance to this theatre is guarded, and that there is no chance of anyone's getting out. Perhaps, Inspector, if you would... He stepped back with a little gesture of resignation. His face wore an expression of worry and depression. He and the inspector and Sir Richard were looking at someone who stood in a corner by the door. And as Nigel followed their gaze, he saw that in the hand of that person was a squat, ugly little automatic, like a toy. "Don't move, anyone," said Robert Warner. The first shock was succeeded by an immense wave of relief, almost exhilaration. He waited with interest to see what the next development would be, and a moment later was feeling acutely ashamed of childishness in harbouring such thoughts. He held Helen's hand more tightly. "It's very foolish of you, Warner," said Sir Richard. "I'm afraid you can't get away. I shall have to risk it. This melodramatic final exit is in the worst of taste, but I fear it can't be helped. Thank you, Mr. Fenn, for allowing me this evening. It was considerate of you. Now, it would be inexpedient of me to linger here, giving you explanations and justifications of my conduct, but in case I never have the chance to say it, I bitterly regret having had to do what I did, not for the sake of my own skin, but because Yuziet was only a misguided little fool, and I had no grudge against Donald at all. For the benefit of posterity, then, let it be put on record, I quite realise I have behaved like an imbecile, and I do think posterity might be interested in anything that concerns me. Rachel, my dear, I'm afraid our nuptials are going to have to be postponed. I shall never be able to make an honest woman of you. I'm sorry. And now, I leave you all. I must warn you that if anyone attempts to follow me, I shall shoot without hesitation. He glanced quickly round the gathering, and was gone. It seemed an age before anyone moved. Actually, it was a matter of seconds. The inspector dragged out a gun and raced down the stairs, with Nigel, Fenn and Sir Richard at his heels. The foyer was empty, but they reached the back of the auditorium in time to see Robert scrambling onto the stage in front of the curtain. He turned as he heard them come in and levelled the gun. There was a sudden deafening report in Nigel's ear. Robert dropped the gun, clutched at his leg, twisted, and dropped like a broken doll. As they ran towards him, they saw that even in the extremity of his pain, he was groping for his glasses, which lay broken a little way out of his reach. It was oddly and terribly pathetic. But they saw more. There was movement at the top of the proscenium arch, and they saw the safety curtain dropping its whole weight with the speed of a guillotine down to the place where Robert, blinding and hurt, lay. Even as Nigel ran for the door which led backstage, he knew it was too late. Even as he ran up the little flight of stone steps, the blood pounding in his ears, he heard the shattering, sickening thud which seemed to shake the whole theatre. In 2 leaps he was up into the electrician's gallery and had reversed the switch. The curtain slid up again as the others clambered over the orchestra pit towards the shapeless thing that lay below. He looked at his companion in that narrow steel place. But Jean Whiteleg stared at him for a moment without comprehension, and then slid fainting to the ground. He made no move to help her. Instead, he gazed down at the little group beneath him, as if out of an infinite distance he heard Fenn's voice. "I am afraid there is nothing we can do now." And the key to the whole thing was simply this. The shot we heard was not the shot that killed Uziet. He, Helen, Nigel, and Sir Richard were once again in the room looking out over the garden and the quadrangle. It was 2 days later. They had just returned from an excellent dinner at the George, for which Helen, to the embarrassment of Sir Richard and the delight of Fenn, had insisted on paying, and were now settled comfortably to listen to the post-mortem. Fenn lay sprawled in an armchair and made precarious gestures with his glass. It was our easy assumption to the opposite effect, which made the whole business seem so impossible, and I realized the truth as I told you 3 minutes after we were in the room. Williams assured us that no one had come in or out. We ourselves were quite rightly convinced that no one could have shot the girl, faked for suicide, and got away in the time. Accident or suicide were equally impossible. So what other alternative was there? Nigel swore gently under his breath. But if there was another shot, where did it go? And how on earth could he fire it, and then put the girl's fingerprints on the gun? Well, of course he didn't fire it from that gun at all. He used an ordinary blank cartridge pistol, after he'd finished faking the real gun. That had the additional advantage of leaving a nice fresh smell of burnt powder on the air, and it also provided the burns on Uziet's face, which suggested she'd shot herself, or been shot at close range. And she wasn't shot at close range? Certainly not. How could she have been? She was alive when she went into that room, and no one followed her in.
"I see a difficulty," said Helen. "This man Williams was in the passage outside, so she couldn't have been shot from there. Donald and Nicholas were in the room opposite, so she couldn't have been shot from there. And Williams watched Robert on the way up. He couldn't have done it then. How did he do it? It seems just as impossible as it ever did."
"Ah, yes, that I agree. You understand that immediately after the murder I had no idea about that. At the time I only knew enough to be able to identify the murderer for certain. There was only one person who could have faked the suicide and fired the decoy shot. That was Warner. No one entered the room from outside, no one left the room opposite except him. Therefore there was again no alternative. He pretended to go to the lavatory, made such arrangements as were necessary, fired the shot, and slipped back to the lavatory before Williams appeared. You understand Juliet was already dead before he went down. Or he may have hidden behind the screen in the sitting-room and gone back after Williams reached the bedroom. Then he came out again and met us as we came down. And as it was reasonable to suppose that only the murderer would have faked the suicide, then obviously Warner was the murderer. A lavatory, by the way, is a very good alibi. One doesn't like to pester a man with questions about it. It probably served another purpose, too. I imagine there are a pair of light gloves and small blank cartridge pistols somewhere in the sewers of Oxford at this moment. What things did he arrange? We shut the window, wangled the fingerprints, put the gun by the body, slipped on the ring. Then he fired off the blank cartridge pistol, holding it to the dead girl's head to make the burns. It can't have taken him more than 3 or 4 minutes in all. Probably less. One contributory point. You'll remember I drew your attention to the fact that nothing was touched in the room until at least a quarter of an hour after we arrived. That meant that nobody felt the gun to see if it had, in fact, been recently fired. If it had, it would have been warm. Doubtless Warner relied on our good police training to prevent us touching anything. And as the matter was already obvious enough, I deferred to the good old convention. We now come to the problem of how the girl was actually shot. You, Helen, have put the difficulties about that pretty lucidly. So there again a process of elimination was the only way. Actually, the solution was given to me by a chance remark of Nicholas's, to the effect that he and Donald had been performing the antisocial act of listening to the wireless with all the windows open. All the windows open. That gave the game away with a vengeance. It meant that the only way Juliet could have been shot was from the west courtyard, through 3 sets of windows, 2 in the room occupied by Donald and Nicholas, and the bedroom window in front of which she was kneeling as she went through the chest of drawers. If you look at a plan, you will see that such a thing was perfectly simple. The 2 windows of the room opposite are practically parallel with the window of Fellowes' bedroom. There's no furniture in the way, and Fellowes and Nicholas were, I ascertained, sitting well out of the line of fire in front of the fireplace. Finally, there was the fact that the wireless was making a lot of noise, playing the Meistersinger overture. If you remember, Herr Liedenben didn't begin until immediately before Warner joined us. I imagine there's little doubt that he used a silencer on the gun and detached it afterwards. Even that would make a certain amount of din, but if he chose his moment well, say the fortissimo re-entry of the main theme, just before the contrapuntal section when all 3 themes are played together, there's little chance of its being heard, and it undoubtedly would have been if he'd shot her when he went down from the room. And then, of course, he could stand well back to avoid being seen by the 2 in the room he was firing through. What an extraordinary idea! To fire from the open air, through a closed room, out into the open air again and into another room. Well, I must say, Fan, it's no wonder I never thought of it. Exactly. At that point, then, it was fairly easy to see what had happened. The acquisition of the weapon presented no difficulties. Warner told Jean at the party that he wanted a revolver for the next morning's rehearsal, and probably guessed that she would somehow contrive to get hold of Graham's gun. Even if she didn't, it hardly mattered, except as an additional safeguard to himself. He could easily have taken it if she hadn't, and the good old traditional flourishing of a weapon before all the suspects was a tolerable alibi in itself. As it happened, she did go back, and as he told us, he saw her. Doubtless he was on the lookout. What he didn't tell us was that he slipped in immediately afterwards and removed the cartridges. I'm assuming this, but it seems the most likely thing. So that when you, Nigel, looked in the drawer, the whole lot was gone. After that, he'd only need to take the gun from the property room, which he did the next afternoon. On the Friday evening, then, he saw Juliet going to Donald's room, or knew that she was going, and provided with the silencer gun, a pair of gloves, and the blank cartridge pistol, which, by the way, he took from the property room along with the real gun. It was used as an effects instrument off stage. And as I thought there was sure to be one in the theatre, I asked Jean if it had gone, and found that it had. Well, he entered the west courtyard from the door from the street, did his bit of shooting at the convenient moment, went out again the same way, he promptly deposited the silencer somewhere temporarily, then came in at the lodge, and up here, as we know. At an appropriate moment, he went down and did the faking. You see now, Nigel, why your timetable was so revealing. Not only did it show that he was the only person who could have done the faking, but it also showed that his time of leaving the hotel was unconfirmed, and that it might have been as late or as early as he pleased. By itself, that wouldn't have mattered, but he bungled the whole thing by trying to make a cryptogram out of it, faking that improbable suicide. Anyone, you, Helen, Rachel, Sheila, Donald, or Nicholas, could have done the shooting from the west courtyard. If he'd left it at that, he'd still be as safe as houses. But, as I said, only one person could have done the faking. I may say there was also some casual evidence, which by itself would have been highly suggestive, though not conclusive. For one thing, there was the fact, of which you informed me, Nigel, and which I subsequently verified, that Warner had deputed Jane to understudy Yuziet. Now, even I know enough about repertory to realize that for very practical reasons it contains no understudying, and certainly not of parts as small as that which Yuziet was to play. But his anxiety for the success of the play led him to make that elementary blunder. Again he told us that he had had to ask his way to the room at the lodge, that he had never been in the college before. Yet in conversation with my wife, immediately after the murder, he suggested that the killer might have come in from the west courtyard, of whose existence, if his other assertion was true, he would not have been aware. That was another blunder, resulting from a tendency to elaborate too much. I confess, though, that certain things didn't seem to me at first to fit in with this simple and quite obvious statement of the facts. One of them, Nigel, was given me by you. You emphasized a good deal the lack of surprise with which Donald received the news of Yuziet's death, but whereas you seem to regard this as a sort of abnormal, unmotivated psychological state, I was inclined to look at it more simply. It meant either that A. Donald had known the murder was going to be committed, or B. he'd seen someone he knew prowling about the place prior to the discovery of the murder, and someone who hated Yuziet, and on hearing the news instantly jumped to the conclusion that that person had done the killing. A was very unlikely. Robert would not have confided in Donald, and the likelihoods of Donald having discovered Robert's plan, which depended in any case a good deal on chance, was so small as to be discounted altogether. That left B. It was, in the first place, possible that Donald had seen Warner himself. But in that case, why should he have kept silent? He disliked Warner, regarded him as a potential rival with Yuziet. Having heard of the death, he was infatuated with her, remember. He would, if he had seen Warner, have revealed the fact. Yet there was somebody he was protecting. Who? Jean Whiteleg, the only person. I assumed, quite provisionally, that he'd seen her in the west courtyard, which was the only place she could have been, and probably while doing the blackout on that side of the room. In such circumstances I also assumed, first, that he would have spoken to her, and second, that as she was there at the time, she would probably have seen the murderer, if not the actual murder. Remember, the blackouts must have been put up only a very short time afterwards. This, at the time, was the merest speculation, but it seemed to me to be worthwhile following up, for my own amusement and satisfaction. I went first to Nicholas, getting out of him without much difficulty the fact that Donald had met and talked to someone that evening, though Nicholas refused to say who it had been. That didn't matter, I was already pretty certain. Even by being severe with Donald, I got nothing out of him. He was being too chivalrous for words. I think to some extent he was relieved by Yuziet's death, not inclined to let Jean, who he still imagined had committed the murder, suffer for it. Jean herself was more helpful. By dint of casting aspirations on the quality of a murderer's mind, I produced a fine outburst of rage and indignation. As it seemed unlikely that she was admiring the crime, it was obvious that she knew who the murderer was. And as she at that time had no idea of the facts of the case, and couldn't have made the deductions I made, it was reasonable to assume she'd seen him. That she should have been determined to protect him, by the way, was not surprising. She had no reason to love Yuziet, and as we know, she had a tremendous admiration for Warner's work. Her scruples were no doubt the same as mine,
a strong disinclination to deliver a great creative artist not yet in his prime into the hands of the hangman. Hence a refusal even to admit that she was in the college that evening. I suggested to her that she should come and tell me privately what she knew, and when Donald was killed she did do that. It appears she followed Warner into the courtyard and actually saw him commit the crime. As with most of us, her first instinct was to hide. She slipped into an archway and waited till he'd gone. It was when she came out that Donald saw her and talked to her. In the circumstances, the conversation on her side must have been pretty strained. No doubt that gave him additional grounds for suspecting she was the killer.
"I imagine," said Sir Richard, "that after the death of Donald Fellows, she wanted to go straight to the police and tell them what she knew. So what stopped her? I hear that she and Fellows had been reconciled. They were intending to marry."
"Oh, Lord, yes. She was practically demented with grief, poor child. But at the same time, I still seemed to be the only person who had the slightest idea what was going on, so I was not going to have my plans interfered with. I intended the first night of matrimania to go through without a hitch, as in fact it did."
"Yes, that was your condition for making us privy to the secrets of your remarkable brain. Anyway, I lied to the girl for all I was worth, invented the most fantastic tales to prove that the murders had been committed by different persons. I half convinced her, enough to keep her quiet for a while, but only half. She realized in the end, with the results, that, well, we all know what happened."
"And now, for heaven's sake," said Nigel, "what about the motive? Surely you didn't kill her just because she was making a nuisance of herself and sending Rachel into temporary tantrums? You've been liable to gnomic utterances on the subject of motive. Explain yourself."
"My gnomic utterances reduce themselves to 3. That I do not believe in the crime passionnel, that the motive for murder is almost always money, vengeance, or security, and that none the less it is sex which is at the root of this business, and I shall explain just how those assertions are justified. The immediate motive was, without any question, the mysterious something for which both Yuziet and the murderer were searching. And my first clue to that came from the admirably lucid account which you, Nigel, gave me of the morning after the party. Two people's incongruous antics led me to believe the possibility that Yuziet had slept with Warner the previous night and was intending to make a song and dance about it. Let me capitulate. 1. Yuziet came into the bar carrying her handbag and a thin red notebook, which she threw down somewhere. 2. Robert, on seeing her, appeared first angry, then uncomfortable. 3. Yuziet regarded him with triumph and defiance. 4. She chatted to him about blackmail and revelations. 5. Donald picked up his music and left, while 6. Yuziet went with you to the bar, keeping her eyes on Robert all the time. 7. Her attention was diverted by you, emptying a glass of brandy over her. 8. She returned with you to the table, stiffened and flushed, and suddenly flounced out. 9. Robert gazed after her with genuine bewilderment. Now, all this, I thought to myself, is extremely odd, and indeed only explicable at all on the assumption that it is the red notebook which is the centre of the furore. You'd seen Yuziet come out of Warner's room earlier that morning. On the strength of 2 and 4, I assumed it was something of great importance to Warner, probably something which seriously incriminated him. The rest, then, fell into place. Yuziet's attitude, her talk of blackmail, doubtless for West End jobs rather than money, the watch she kept on him, and the last 2 items obviously meant that Yuziet had turned back from her diversion to find the notebook gone, and second, it was not Warner who'd taken it. You see, it fitted perfectly. It explains why she was searching Fellow's room, and it explained why she was killed. Despite the fact the actual proof was out of her hands, she knew too much to be left alive. Your motive, security. It was obvious to me, as later it became obvious to her, and as it was almost immediately obvious to Warner, that it was Fellows who'd gone off with a notebook, gathering it up carelessly with his music. It was at that point, however, that my logic was entirely to the winds. I made the fatal mistake of assuming that Warner had found the book among Donald's music, unlooked at, possibly when he killed Uziette, or rather when he went to fake the suicide. In fact, he did nothing of the sort. He'd no time to make a search, and after that the room was under guard till 4:30 on Sunday. Then he looked round, failed to find it, as I failed to find it when I looked earlier and thought he already had it, and went up to the organ loft. There's little doubt, I think, that by the time Fellows discovered the thing, looked at it, and realized its implications, apart from anything else, it provided the only real motive for the killing of Uziette. And as a matter of fact, there were a few faint red stains on one of his pieces of music, where the cover had smeared against it. What his feelings were when he saw Warner, God knows, but Warner realized he knew, had gone up prepared for it, in fact, and took the only possible course. I don't quite see where the music and the notebook were, if not in Donald's room. Well, they were in the organ loft, of course, the obvious place. As to the contents of the notebook, I could only guess. But I remember Warner had been in South America several times before the war, and I thought it just possible he might be remotely connected with the industry for which that part of the globe is notorious. Procuring. I rang up a friend on the Secretariat of the League, and learned from him that Warner had in fact been suspected of complicity in the matter, but nothing could be proved against him. That was before the war, naturally. Nothing of that sort can be carried on now. But I claim no credit for that part of it. It was the merest fluke. But that was what I meant when I said that the questing beast was, in fact, the root of the business, though the actual motive was security. I'm afraid I wasn't able to whip up much indignation about Warner's goings-on. It always seemed to me that unless these girls are actually shanghaied, they're less sinned against than sinning. It seems an extraordinary sideline for a great playwright, though. But there was a sort of ironic twist in Warner's character, a kind of deep fatalism, which forbade him to take anything seriously. Even the murders he didn't take seriously. They were both brilliant, chancy affairs. There was a long silence. Then Helen said slowly, "I'm glad the play couldn't go on after that one performance. Even if Rachel could have done it, it seems right. There should have been just one, and a perfect one." A magnificent final exit, I agree, but a final exit nonetheless. The world is the poorer for it. But what's happened to Rachel, by the way?
She's gone off to the country, and Jean has been sent home to her parents.
In the circumstances, we couldn't possibly have proceeded against her anyway. She was helping to apprehend an escaping murderer. Not that he ever had any chance of escape, and least of all when that thing crushed him. They all looked at Ven. He smoothed back his unruly hair, and seemed suddenly old and tired, and said, "It's been an abominable business, and we are all the worse as a result. There will be no more Metromania. I, for one, cannot thank God for it." The journey from Oxford to Didcot and thence to Paddington involves difficulties of a different kind from those experienced in travelling in the inverse direction. The train, once it gets started at all, moves at a uniform if unspectacular pace. The problem is to know when it is going to start. Nicholas always insisted that the first train to leave in the morning was deliberately made 10 minutes late, that this made the next train even later, and that the process went on cumulatively throughout the day. At a certain stage in the day, however, he averred, the train behind caught up with the one in front, the 12:35 left at 1:10, and the 1:10 at 1:35, so that at the end of the day there were probably several trains which never ran at all. Be that as it may, it is certain that if you reached the station in time for your train, you had to wait at least half an hour, whereas if you relied, as you reasonably might, on its being even 10 minutes late, it invariably left on time, and you missed it. It was this which led Nicholas to insist that the blind god of chance wore the uniform of the GWR. The 6 people who travelled up during the week of October 19th to 26th, 1940, were, however, little affected by this difficulty. One way and another they were all too happy to care. Nicholas, who was seen off by his blonde at the station, was pleased at the melodramatic conclusion of the case. Also, he thought it had enlarged his conception of certain Shakespearean characters. Goneril, for example, should always be played by a young woman with red hair. Ben's a clever devil, despite the fact he considers me a fascist.
Aren't you a fascist? Said the blonde.
Certainly not. I'm an earnest supporter of this war. That's why I'm going back to town.
What are you going to do when you get there, then?
Find a war job. Not, heaven help me, in a factory with odious machines and odious jazzes blaring away half the day from mechanical contrivances, but something civilized and useful. The train came in. He climbed into a first-class compartment and leaned out of the window. The reluctance of most trains to start, he reflected, makes the pleonasm of one's carefully prepared parting phrases rather tedious. There's no need to wait, you know.
I'm not going to wait. I'm coming with you.
Why?
Sooner or later I intend to marry you for the purposes described in the order of the solemnization of holy matrimony. I'm sorry to be pushing, but I'm rather fond of you, you see, and you're such an ass you'll never succeed in getting married on your own initiative.
Oh dear, I must reread Much Ado. My situation becomes more Benedictine every moment. But you know, I think I should find it rather pleasant. Fen and Sir Richard travelled up together. Fen had practically forgotten about the case already, though if tackled on the subject he would have strenuously denied that. His interest in what was going on around him was so intense that it really precluded any very prolonged recollection. He was a man who lived almost entirely in the present. At the moment he was engaged in a strenuous dissertation on the merits of Wyndham Lewis, and at intervals trying to dissuade Sir Richard, with well-calculated rudeness, from writing the critical and appreciative volume on Robert Warner's work which he contemplated doing. He was as happy as a schoolboy on a half-holiday, and commented in penetrating whispers and with increasing offensiveness on the physical appearance and probable vices of the other persons in the compartment. Helen and Nigel, married 4 days previously, were more or less oblivious to anything except each other. They spent their all-too-brief honeymoon cycling in the countryside round Oxford. And now Nigel was returning to his work, and Helen was going to begin rehearsals with the eminent actor.
Goodbye, Oxford. You know, I'm sorry to be leaving you.
Oxford's a wearing place. The idle, free and easy, unconventional life. It's too stern a test of character for me. I always loathed it at the time, and yet I could never resist the temptation to go back.
We'll go back one day and have a little private requiem for the dead. Not for Robert, because I don't think he needs it. I think it was a sensible idea of Sheila to get another play into rehearsal straight away. And she did it well, too. Did you see the inspector and his wife 2 rows in front of us?
Yes, good heavens. She looks exactly like Hedy Lamarr. What a capture! White as the sun, fair as the lily. That's an odd comparison, isn't it? Is the sun white?
Don't be dismal, Nigel. I can't understand, she added, returning to her copy of Cymbeline, why a man of so fair an outward and such stuff within should get drunk and make such a silly bet in the first place.
Oh, by the way, did you go and say goodbye to Gervase?
Of course I did. We talked about gardens and food and the state of Christ's Church militant on earth. He had his extraordinary hat on.
There's been too much Shakespeare in this case already, said Fen gloomily. He and Nigel had met in the bar during the first interval of a performance of King Lear, and Nigel, tortured by the recollections of a problem still unsolved, had taken the opportunity to ask him about the ring, the gilded fly. Too much Shakespeare. I'm preparing a new anthology, awful lines from Shakespeare. Alas, poor Gloucester, lost he his other eye? We'll have pride of place. The ring, then? Well, purely a baroque flourish on the main structure. A little cynical personal touch. I didn't recognise the reference until I happened to mention the gilded fly in the same breath with Mr. Morrison's slogan. It was partly, I think, an ironic salute to Jusiette's main interest in life, and partly an intimation of measure for measure. By sex she lived, by sex or because of sex she died. A poetic retribution. The ring had happened to be a handy symbol. Few murderers can resist decorating. But what is the reference? These people have cut the play about so badly, one does not know where it will turn up. But if I remember rightly, it is in Act 4, Scene 4. Die for adultery? No. The wren goes to it, and the small gilded fly does lecher in my sight. Let copulation thrive. The second bell rang. Gervase Fenn finished his drink with reluctance. I can't understand why they allow foreign actors to play in Shakespeare. One can't make out a word they're saying half the time.